Amara, a talented black chef, fought her entire life to be recognized in a world that constantly tried to diminish her worth. Her restaurant, a symbol of her struggle and success, became her sanctuary. But when a racist patron's insult ignites a chain of events, Amara is forced to confront a betrayal that threatens to tear apart everything she's worked for. Will she rise above the prejudice, or is the fight to prove herself a battle she can never truly win? The kitchen hummed with life, a symphony of sizzling pans, chopping knives, and the faint murmur of orders being called out. Amara Jones moved through the chaos with practiced ease, her white chef's jacket spotless, her hands swift and deliberate. The warmth of the ovens and the sharp aroma of freshly chopped herbs surrounded her like an embrace, yet her chest felt tight tonight, a feeling she couldn't shake. She slid a pan onto the stovetop, the seared halibut sizzling as she reached for the lemon zest. Around her, her team worked like a well-oiled machine, each move precise, their voices steady. Amara had built this kitchen from the ground up. Each member of her staff was handpicked, trained under her watchful eye. And yet, she couldn't quiet the unease simmering beneath her focus. Through the narrow window of the kitchen door, she could glimpse the dining room. The savory haven had become a name people spoke with reverence. Its muted gold lighting, the soft clink of silverware on porcelain, the low hum of conversation, it all exuded quiet sophistication. Tonight, every table was full, just like it had been for months. She couldn't say exactly when the tension began. Maybe it was the slight hesitations from her sous chef earlier, or the unusual tightness in the maitre d's shoulders as he stepped into the kitchen with updates. Whatever it was, Amara felt it like an itch she couldn't scratch. And then she heard it, a sharp voice rising above the calm murmur of the dining room. Her hand froze over the garnish she was about to sprinkle. The voice was loud enough to cut through the kitchen window, even over the din of her team at work. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was disdain. Amara's heart sank as her eyes locked on the door. For a second, she considered ignoring it, letting the front-of-house staff handle whatever was happening. But the knot in her chest tightened, and her feet were already moving before she could stop herself. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements deliberate but steady, and pushed open the swinging door. The dining room greeted her with its familiar warmth, but all she could focus on was the table in the corner. A man, middle-aged and dressed in a suit that screamed old money, was leaning forward in his chair, his face twisted with contempt. His voice carried across the room, drawing the eyes of nearby diners who exchanged uneasy glances but kept their heads down. "This is what you call fine dining," he scoffed, holding his fork aloft as if the food on it were an insult. "I've had better meals in a truck stop." Amara's gaze shifted to the plate in front of him, a beautifully plated coq au vin, one of the restaurant's signature dishes. It looked flawless. The man's voice rose again, sharper this time. "And who's responsible for this?" he demanded, waving the fork as if it were a weapon. "I want to speak to the chef." For a moment, Amara stood rooted to the spot. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room as conversations hushed and heads turned toward her. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She dealt with difficult customers before. This wasn't new. Straightening her spine, she walked toward the table with measured steps. The man didn't look up until she was standing directly in front of him. When he finally did, his eyes flickered with surprise, followed by something darker, something Amara recognized immediately. "You're the chef," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. Amara held her ground, her voice steady but firm. "I am. I understand you're not satisfied with your meal. Could you tell me what the issue is?" He leaned back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his face. "The issue," he said, dragging out the words, "is that this," he gestured to the plate as if it were garbage, "is unacceptable. I expected better from a place with your reputation." Amara's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said. "We take pride in our food here. If there's something specific you'd like changed, I'd be happy to make it right." The man laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. "Make it right," he said. "Do you even know what fine dining is? Or did you just wander in here from some barbecue joint and think you could play chef?" The words hit her like slap, but she refused to let them show. Years of dealing with subtle slights and outright disrespect had taught her how to mask the sting. She stood straighter, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "Sir," she said, her voice as smooth as polished stone, "if you have a problem with the food, I'd be happy to address it. But if you're here to insult me, I'm afraid I can't help you." The man's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he leaned forward again, his voice dropping into a low, venomous hiss. "You're damn right I have a problem. And it's not just the food. It's this whole charade. You don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Amara felt the weight of them pressing down on her chest, but she refused to let it show. She couldn't. Not here, not now. Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What seems to be the problem here?" Amara turned to see the restaurant's owner, Evelyn Shaw, striding toward the table. Evelyn was in her early 50s, with an air of authority that could silence a room. Her tailored suit was as sharp as her gaze, which flicked between the man and Amara with practiced precision. The man opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn raised a hand, cutting him off. "I asked what the problem was," she repeated, her voice calm but edged with steel. The man hesitated, clearly taken aback by her sudden arrival. "The problem," he said finally, his tone defensive, "is the food. It's not up to standard." Evelyn arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Interesting," she said, "because that dish happens to be one of our most popular. It's also prepared by one of the finest chefs in this city." The man's face flushed, his confidence visibly faltering. "Well, And," Evelyn continued, her voice growing sharper, "if I'm not mistaken, you've been coming here for months. This isn't your first time ordering this dish, is it?" The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Amara watched as the power dynamic shifted, the man shrinking under Evelyn's gaze. Evelyn turned to Amara, her expression softening. "Chef Jones," she said, "would you excuse us for a moment? I'd like to have a word with our guest." Amara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay, but the subtle nod Evelyn gave her was enough. She stepped back, retreating to the kitchen, though not before catching the low, firm tone of Evelyn's voice as she began to speak to the man. Back in the kitchen, Amara gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. The tension that had been simmering in her chest finally spilled over, leaving her breathless. The sound of the kitchen continued around her, oblivious to the storm she was weathering. And yet, as she stood there, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Amara's chest rose and fell as she struggled to steady her breathing. She grabbed a clean towel and wiped her hands, more out of habit than necessity. The kitchen buzzed on around her, orders being called out, flames flickering under pans, knives clattering against cutting boards, but it all felt distant, like she was standing behind a pane of glass. She hated that the man's words had gotten to her, that they had wedged themselves into the cracks of her composure. After all these years, she thought she had grown immune to it. But the truth was, no matter how much success she achieved, no matter how many glowing reviews or full dining rooms she earned, there would always be people like him, people who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. "Chef." The voice snapped her back to reality. It was her sous chef, Ben, standing a few feet away with a plate in his hands. He was in his early 20s, fresh out of culinary school, with a boyish face and a quiet respect for her that she appreciated. "Yes," she said, forcing her voice to steady. "This is the duck for table 5, he said, holding up the plate. "Just want to make sure it's up to standard before it goes out." Amara walked over, inspecting the dish with a critical eye. The duck was perfectly seared, the skin crisp and golden, the sauce drizzled with precision. For a moment, she allowed herself to focus entirely on the food, letting the act of critiquing ground her. "It's perfect," she said, giving Ben a small nod. "Send out." Ben hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the dining room. "Everything okay out there?" Amara's jaw tightened. "It's handled," she said curtly, then softened her tone. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Service is going well." Ben nodded and disappeared into the dining room, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts. She took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders to release some of the tension. But before she could fully collect herself, the kitchen door swung open, and Evelyn stepped inside. The shift in the room was immediate. Every member of the staff straightened, their movements becoming sharper, more deliberate. Evelyn commanded respect without having to say a word. She walked over to Amara, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a faint tension in her eyes that Amara didn't like. "Are you okay?" Evelyn asked, her voice low enough that only Amara could hear. Amara nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak just yet. "I dealt with him," Evelyn continued. "He won't be coming back." Amara looked at her, surprised. "You banned him." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "He didn't leave me much of a choice. His behavior was unacceptable." Amara wanted to feel relief, maybe even gratitude, but instead, she felt a pang of guilt. She hated causing scenes, hated feeling like she was a problem that needed solving. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Sorry. Amara, you have nothing to apologize for. That man was out of line, and you handled it with more grace than most people would have." Amara opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded again, the knot in her chest loosening just a little. Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of warmth. "Take a minute if you need to," she said, "but don't let him get to you. You're better than that." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Amara alone once again. Amara exhaled slowly, her mind replaying the scene in the dining room. She knew Evelyn was right. She couldn't let people like that man take up space in her mind. But no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, his words lingered, like the faint smell of something burnt that refused to fade. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Service continued smoothly, with plates flying out of the kitchen and satisfied customers leaving glowing compliments in their wake. But Amara moved through it all on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. It wasn't until the final table had been served and the last pan scrubbed clean that she allowed herself to sit down. The kitchen was quiet now, the frenetic energy of the evening replaced by a stillness that felt almost eerie. She sat at the stainless steel counter, nursing a cup of chamomile tea. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m., but she wasn't ready to go home just yet. The door to the kitchen opened, and Ben poked his head in. "Hey, chef, we're heading out. You good?" Amara offered a faint smile. "Yeah, thanks, Ben. See you tomorrow." He gave her a small wave and disappeared, leaving her alone once again. She stared into her tea, her reflection rippling in the surface. She thought about the man's words, the way he had looked at her as if she didn't belong. And for the first time all night, she let herself feel the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had doubted her, every person who had told her she wouldn't make it, every person who had looked at her and seen anything but the skilled, dedicated chef she was. Her grip tightened around the mug. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let people like him define her. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her coat draped over one arm. "Still here," Evelyn said, her tone light but curious. Amara nodded. "Just needed a moment." Evelyn walked over, leaning against the counter. "You're allowed to have bad days, you know," she said. "Even you." Amara huffed a small laugh. "It's not about that. It's just some things stick with you, no matter how much you try to let them go." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I get it, but don't forget, you've earned your place here. No one can take that from you." Amara looked at her, the sincerity in her words cutting through the fog in her mind. "Thanks, Evelyn." Evelyn smiled, then straightened up. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." Amara watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her. She sat there for a while longer, the tea growing cold in her hands. Finally, she stood up, turned off the lights, and walked out of the kitchen. As she stepped into the crisp night air, she looked up at the sky, the stars scattered like tiny beacons of light. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. Tomorrow was another day, and she would face it, just as she always had, with strength, grace, and the unshakable belief that she belonged. The soft glow of the morning sun streamed through the restaurant's windows as Amara arrived at work, her steps steady but her thoughts turbulent. She had spent the night replaying yesterday's confrontation in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. The memory gnawed at her like an itch she couldn't quite scratch, but she had resolved to bury it under the familiar rhythm of her work. Today was a new day, and the kitchen was her sanctuary. As she pushed open the kitchen door, the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread greeted her. The morning prep crew was already hard at work, chopping, slicing, stirring, and the hum of activity brought a faint smile to her face. Ben approached her with a clipboard, his face lit with the excitement of someone eager to impress. "Chef, I wanted to run a few specials by you for tonight," he said. Amara glanced at the clipboard, scanning the neatly written notes. "Good ideas," she said with a nod. "Let's try the saffron risotto as the main special. I think it'll pair well with the wine selection this week." Ben beamed. "Got it. I'll make sure everything's prepped." She watched him head back to his station, his enthusiasm infectious. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe today would be different. But as the day wore on, a strange tension began to creep into the air. It was subtle at first, a whispered conversation here, a lingering glance there, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her suspicion was confirmed when Evelyn walked into the kitchen shortly before lunch service, her usually composed demeanor slightly frayed. "Amara, can I speak with you for a moment?" Evelyn said, her tone clipped. Amara followed her into the small office at the back of the restaurant, a sense of unease settling in her chest. Evelyn closed the door behind them and turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "We have a situation," Evelyn began, folding her arms. "This morning, I received a call from the regional food critic for the Culinary Chronicle. Apparently, there's a rumor circulating about the restaurant." Amara frowned. "What kind of rumor?" Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor before meeting Amara's eyes. "That we've been buying pre-made sauces and passing them off as housemaid." The words hit Amara like a punch to the gut. "What?" she said, her voice rising. "That's ridiculous. We make everything from scratch. You know that." "I do," Evelyn said quickly. "But rumors like this can spread fast, and if it reaches the wrong ears, it could damage our reputation." Amara's mind raced. Who would say something like that? And why? "Do you have any idea where this could be coming from?" Evelyn asked, her tone gentler now. Amara shook her head. "No, but I'll find out." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "I'm counting on you, Amara. If anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's you." As Amara left the office, her mind was already working overtime. The kitchen staff was small, tight-knit. She trusted them, but the thought that someone within her team could be responsible gnawed at her. She decided to start with the new supplier they had recently begun working with. It was a long shot, but maybe there had been a mix-up in one of the deliveries. She called the supplier during her break, her tone firm but professional. The manager assured her that all products delivered to the restaurant were raw ingredients, nothing pre-made. Amara hung up the phone, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. If the supplier wasn't the source, then the rumor had to be coming from someone closer to home. Returning to the kitchen, she scanned the room, her gaze lingering on each member of her team. Everyone seemed focused on their tasks, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding something. Her thoughts were interrupted when Ben approached her, holding a tray of desserts. "Chef, do you want to try these before we send them out?" he asked, his tone cheerful as ever. Amara nodded, tasting the tiramisu and giving him a distracted thumbs up. But as he walked away, she noticed something, a faint smudge of red sauce on his apron. It was odd, considering he hadn't been assigned to work with the sauces that day. "Ben," she called, her voice sharp. He turned, a flicker of nervousness crossing his face. "Yes, chef." "Were you working with the tomato sauce earlier?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Ben hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. No. Why?" Amara's suspicion deepened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "No reason," she said, turning back to her station. For the rest of the day, she kept a close eye on Ben. He seemed jumpier than usual, his movements hurried, and his gaze avoiding hers. As the evening service came to an end, Amara lingered in the kitchen, waiting for the last of the staff to leave. When Ben finally gathered his things to go, she stopped him at the door. "Ben," she said, her tone firm, "we need to talk." He froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "About what?" Amara crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "About the rumor. Do you know anything about it?" Ben's face went pale. "What? No. I don't know anything." "Then why do you seem so nervous?" "I'm not," he started, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Amara stepped closer, her voice lowering. "If you know something, now's the time to tell me. I need to protect this restaurant, Ben, and I can't do that if people aren't honest with me." Ben's shoulders slumped, and he let out a shaky breath. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it's not what you think." Amara waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "There's this guy," Ben began, avoiding her gaze. "He came by last week, asking questions about the restaurant. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I'm wondering if maybe he's the one spreading the rumor." "What kind of questions?" Amara asked, her voice tight. "Stuff about how we prepare the food, where we get our ingredients. He said he was a reporter, but he didn't seem professional. I didn't tell him much, I swear." Amara's mind raced. Who was this reporter? And what was his agenda? "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" she demanded. "I didn't think it was a big deal." Ben said, his voice rising. "I didn't know it would turn into this." Amara took a deep breath, trying to rein in her frustration. "If you see him again, you come straight to me. Understand?" Ben nodded quickly. "Yes, chef. I'm sorry." "Go home," she said, her tone softer now. "We'll deal with this tomorrow." As Ben left, Amara sat down at the counter, her mind spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Who was this so-called reporter? And why would he target her restaurant? One thing was clear. This wasn't over. And if someone was trying to take her down, they were about to learn just how far she was willing to go to protect what she had built. Amara woke to the dull hum of the world outside her apartment window. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the blinds, soft yet insistent. It wasn't the light she resented, but the weight of the uncertainty that had settled within her since last night. The conversation with Ben had left her uneasy, his nervousness lingering in the air long after he had left. She had wanted to brush it off, but something kept gnawing at her, pulling her back to the edges of that conversation. The stillness of her apartment only seemed to amplify the noise in her head. What was it about Ben's sudden shift in behavior that unsettled her so? She had known him for years, worked side by side with him during long nights in the kitchen, shared laughs over prep work, and stories over quick bites of food. His sudden guilt felt misplaced. Was he protecting someone, or was he afraid of something he hadn't yet told her? The questions circled around her like vultures, closing in on the quiet places she had once trusted. She stood up, her thoughts fighting against the routine she had meticulously built for herself, one of structure, discipline, and precision in the kitchen. The hours before the lunch rush would be her refuge again. She could bury herself in work, keep herself busy, and at least for a while, avoid confronting the chaos outside. But the world outside was already intruding. Her phone buzzed, Evelyn's name flashed on the screen. Amara sighed, already bracing for what she assumed was bad news. Amara. Evelyn's voice was tight, laced with an emotion Amara couldn't quite place. The critic from the Culinary Chronicle. He's coming in tonight for dinner service. He wants a table right at the heart of the action. He wants to see the show. Amara's stomach sank. The restaurant was already on edge, dealing with rumors that clung to the walls like stubborn smoke. The thought of a high-profile critic adding more pressure was unbearable. "Are you serious?" Amara asked, trying to sound calm but failing. "You know, the last thing we need right now is someone with an agenda coming in here." "I know, but he's got influence, Amara," Evelyn replied, her voice quieter now. "And we need all the help we can get. I'm counting on you to make tonight flawless. We need to show him that the rumors are just that, rumors." Amara felt the weight of her manager's words crash over her. She wasn't sure if she was more anxious about the critic or the growing sense of betrayal from someone within her own team. "I'll handle it," Amara said, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts. "I'll make sure everything's perfect." "Good. I'm trusting you." The line went dead, leaving Amara alone with her thoughts. The words of that conversation echoed in her mind. We need to show him that the rumors are just that. But what if the rumors weren't just rumors? What if there was truth in the whispers she had been ignoring? What if, in her pursuit of perfection, she had overlooked something crucial, something closer than she had ever imagined? As she prepared for the evening rush, the kitchen buzzed with the usual pre-service energy, but there was something more underneath it. Amara could feel it in her bones, the sense of something being wrong. It wasn't just the critic or the rumors. There was a tension between her and the rest of the staff that she couldn't shake. Every exchange felt loaded with unspoken words. When Ben walked in, his usual bright demeanor was gone, replaced by a kind of apprehension that was hard to ignore. He avoided her gaze, his movements more hurried than usual. It didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the kitchen, either. Amara caught the flicker of concern in one of the line cook's eyes as he looked between her and Ben. She approached Ben at his station, forcing herself to act casual, but the unease in her stomach was growing. "Ben, you all right?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with underlying concern. He hesitated, and for the briefest moment, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, something he had always hidden so well. "Yeah, chef. Just tired. Long night." Amara pressed her lips together, not convinced. "If you're feeling off, let me know. We need to be sharp tonight, especially with the critic coming." Ben nodded, but his eyes were distant. "I know. I'll be fine." It was the way he said it that unsettled her. His tone was too detached, as though he was shutting her out. Amara forced herself to walk away, but her mind was already spinning with possibilities. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she felt the grip of suspicion tightening around her like a noose. The night arrived faster than she had expected. The restaurant was buzzing with energy, and Amara could feel the tension in the air as she stood at the pass, preparing the plates for the front-of-house team. The critic's table was set up right in the middle of the dining room, a spot that made her stomach twist every time she glanced over. She could see him already, a sharp-dressed man with an air of importance, sitting across from a woman whose demeanor radiated impatience. He glanced up at the kitchen occasionally, but his eyes were more focused on the menu than anything else. The evening unfolded with the familiar chaos of dinner service, and Amara did her best to keep everything in motion, to keep the tension under control. But something wasn't right. She could feel the cracks forming beneath the surface, and it wasn't just the critic's discerning eye that was bothering her. There was a shift in the way the kitchen was moving. The crew was off, distracted, as though they too could sense the storm coming. And then it happened. A small, seemingly insignificant thing, but enough to throw the entire service into disarray. Amara noticed Ben's station had become uncharacteristically messy. He had missed plating one of the appetizers, something she had seen him do 100 times without issue. "Ben, get it together." Amara snapped, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She didn't usually raise her voice, especially not in front of the front of house, but tonight she couldn't afford any mistakes. Ben's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed startled by her outburst. He quickly rearranged the dish, trying to cover up his mistake, but the damage was done. The tension in the kitchen was palpable, and Amara could feel the eyes of the other cooks on her. The critic, who had been watching the kitchen closely all night, leaned over to the woman sitting across from him. They exchanged a few quiet words, their eyes occasionally flicking over to Amara, their expressions unreadable. When the meal was over and the staff began to clean up, Amara approached Ben again. This time, there was no pretending. "What's going on with you?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. "You've been off all night. Are you hiding something?" Ben's face paled, and for a moment, he looked like he might say something. But then, he shook his head, his eyes avoiding hers. "Nothing, chef. It's nothing." But Amara didn't believe him. She had learned to read people over the years, and Ben was hiding something that might just unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. As the night came to an end, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into a web of lies and deceit, a web that was slowly tightening around her. And she had no idea who was pulling the strings. The evening had worn on, each passing minute stretching out like a heavy, suffocating breath. The kitchen buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, the clattering of pots and pans masking the tension in Amara's chest. The critic had left an hour ago, his review still hanging like an unseen weight. Evelyn had been all smiles and false reassurances, but Amara could feel it, the shift, the ripple in the air that had spread through the entire team. Something had changed, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Ben had been quieter than usual. His movements had become mechanical, distant. Every now and then, she caught him staring into space, his brow furrowed like he was wrestling with some inner battle. Amara had given him space, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the nagging feeling in her gut refused to let it go. The unease was mounting, piling on top of each other, until it was all she could think about. The last plate was sent out, the final course completed. The team exhaled in collective relief, the rush of the night finally winding down. Amara wiped her hands on her apron, surveying the kitchen. There was no chaos left, only the remnants of a long, exhausting shift. Yet, the emptiness in her chest remained. Something was wrong, something she hadn't seen. She glanced over at Ben again, his back to her, as he meticulously cleaned his station. His fingers moved in a way that seemed too deliberate, too stiff for someone who usually flowed with ease in the kitchen. And then it happened. The phone buzzed in her pocket. A message. She reached for it absent-mindedly, distracted by the sight of Ben's strange demeanor. Her eyes widened when she saw the notification. It was from Evelyn. "You need to see this. It's about Ben. Meet me at the office." Amara's breath caught in her throat. She had no time to process what it could mean. Her mind already raced ahead, filling in the blanks she didn't want to see. She forced her feet to move, leaving the kitchen behind, her pulse quickening with each step. Evelyn's office was tucked away in the back corner of the restaurant, behind a closed door. It was a small, unassuming room that Amara had passed through 100 times. But tonight, it felt like the gate to some other world. She knocked sharply, her knuckles grazing the wood, feeling the vibration of her nerves travel up her arm. "Come in," came Evelyn's voice, muffled behind the door. Amara opened it, stepping inside. Evelyn was sitting at her desk, a laptop open in front of her, her eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of Amara's neck stand up. The air was thick with something unsaid, something that churned beneath the surface of Evelyn's professional facade. "What's going on?" Amara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Evelyn looked up, her expression tight. "Sit down," she said, her voice lower than usual. Amara's gaze flicked to the chair across from her, but before she could sit, Evelyn gestured to the screen. "Look at this." Amara moved closer, her eyes darting to the laptop. What she saw made her stomach drop. The screen was filled with a string of messages, text conversations between Ben and someone else, someone Amara didn't recognize at first. She leaned in closer, her heart thudding in her chest. Ben, and someone else. What is this? Amara whispered, a sense of dread creeping over her as she scrolled. Evelyn cleared her throat, her face still unreadable. That's from a burner phone he's been using. We didn't catch it at first, but, Amara, he's been talking to someone inside the organization. He's been feeding them information. About you. About the kitchen. About everything. The words hit Amara like a slap in the face. She stumbled back, her knees buckling beneath her as the reality of it sank in. Betrayal. The words swirled around in her mind, twisting, distorting her perception of everything she thought she knew. No, she breathed, her voice thin and shaking. This isn't possible. Ben wouldn't. Evelyn cut her off, her eyes sharp. Amara, I know you don't want to believe it, but we've traced the messages. The leaks go all the way back to last month. The information about the kitchen's weaknesses. The rumors about your management style. Even the details about the critic's arrival tonight. He's been feeding them all along. Amara's breath hitched, her world tilting dangerously. Ben, the man she had trusted, the one she had always seen as an ally, was the one pulling the strings from the shadows. He had been feeding their private details to someone else, someone who had no right to be involved in their business. He had undermined everything she'd worked for. I don't understand, Amara said, her voice trembling as she sank into the chair, her mind spinning. Why? Why would he do this? Evelyn hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. We don't know yet, but it's clear he's been playing both sides. He's been manipulating everyone, working with the competition, leaking information to sabotage you. The people he's been talking to, I think they want to take you down. The words crashed down on Amara like a tidal wave. She had been so focused on the external pressures, the critics, the rumors, the team's discontent, that she hadn't even considered this. Betrayal from within. She had spent so long trying to trust the people around her, trying to believe that the kitchen was a place where everyone was in it together. But now, that belief fell shattered, broken into 1,000 jagged pieces. I should have seen this, Amara muttered, her hand clutching the edge of the desk. I should have known. Evelyn's voice softened, a rare moment of empathy slipping through her professional armor. You trusted him, Amara. You can't blame yourself for that. But Amara couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow complicit in her own downfall. She had allowed herself to be blind, allowed herself to believe that everything was as it seemed. And now, with the evidence laid bare in front of her, there was no denying the truth. The walls she had built around herself, the ones that had kept her grounded, were crumbling. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece everything together. She thought of Ben's strange behavior, his odd detachment during the last few days. He had been slipping away from her, from the team, and now she knew why. He had never been on her side. He had never been loyal. Where is he now? Amara asked, her voice low, filled with a quiet rage she hadn't realized was building. He left after service, Evelyn replied, her tone cold now, as though she had already accepted the betrayal for what it was. But we've traced the messages. He's gone underground. We're not sure where he is. Amara stood up, her heart pounding. She felt the anger and betrayal surge through her, filling every part of her body with a burning need for action. She wasn't going to let Ben get away with this. Not after everything. I'm going to find him, she said, her voice sharp, full of resolve. I'm going to confront him. Evelyn didn't try to stop her. Instead, she nodded slowly. Be careful. You don't know who's really behind this. Amara didn't need to hear any more. She walked out of the office, the door slamming shut behind her. The restaurant felt suffocating now, the air thick with secrets, with lies that had festered in the shadows. She had been blind to them, but not anymore. As she stepped out into the night, the cool air bit at her skin, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the fire inside her. She was done playing by the rules. She was done trusting people who didn't deserve it. She was going to find Ben, and she was going to get the answers she needed, answers that would unravel everything. Amara's hands trembled as she walked through the dimly lit streets, her mind still reeling from what she had just discovered. The revelation about Ben was like a hammer to her chest, knocking the wind out of her, but the fury that had ignited in her didn't feel like relief. It was raw, animalistic. She could feel her pulse thudding in her ears, each beat a reminder of the betrayal that now shaped her every thought. She needed answers. She needed to understand why. And more importantly, she needed to stop this, whatever it was, from spiraling further out of control. But the questions kept multiplying, each one darker than the last. The night was colder than she expected, the sharp wind slicing through her jacket as she quickened her pace. Her footsteps echoed off the wet pavement, the sound of her feet beating in time with her racing thoughts. She wasn't entirely sure where she was going, but she had to move, had to do something. The uncertainty was gnawing at her, relentless. It was like a heavy fog, clouding her vision. As she turned a corner, she spotted a figure standing by the alleyway, someone she had not expected to see tonight. It was Ben. He leaned against the brick wall, his posture casual, but the intensity in his eyes as they met hers was unmistakable. It sent a chill down her spine. Amara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected to find him somewhere, anywhere. But here, standing in front of her, was not the confrontation she had imagined. There was no apology, no pleading, no remorse. Just the cold, hard eyes of a man who had betrayed her. "What the hell are you doing here?" she snapped, her voice rising in spite of herself. The anger that had been building inside her since Evelyn's revelation was threatening to explode. Ben didn't flinch. He simply pushed off the wall, taking a step closer, his presence overwhelming, like a storm cloud descending on her. His voice was low, almost mocking. "I could ask you the same thing." Amara took a step back, her chest tight, her mind scrambling to keep up with her emotions. "You think this is funny? You think this is some kind of game?" Ben sighed, as if he was tired of playing a role. "You don't get it, do you?" He stepped closer again, his face inches from hers now. "None of this is personal. It's business." Business. The word tasted like acid on her tongue. "You've been feeding information to someone else, betraying everything we've worked for, and you think this is just business?" "Of course it is," he said, his eyes narrowing, the venom in his voice unmistakable. "You've been so focused on playing the martyr, Amara, that you haven't even seen what's been happening around you. You think people are loyal. You think they'll care about your dream, about your kitchen? It's all a joke, Amara." Her stomach twisted as his words settled in, like a cold weight dragging her deeper into the dark waters of her own doubts. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, but her voice was smaller now, the conviction faltering. Ben's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no humor in it. "You're not the only one with a vision. I had a plan from the start, a way out, and now, I'm taking it." Amara's mind reeled. She had seen the signs, but she hadn't connected the dots. Ben hadn't just been working against her. He had been working for something bigger, something that involved more than just the kitchen, more than just the restaurant. He had been positioning himself, setting the stage for something far more dangerous. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. You've been planning this for months." Ben's gaze softened, as though pitying her. "Don't be naive, Amara. You thought you could keep control of everything. You thought you could be the hero of your own story. But there are always bigger players pulling the strings." A heavy silence followed, the weight of his words hanging between them, suffocating the air around them. Amara couldn't breathe. She had been blind to it, too focused on saving her own dream to see the truth. The lies had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface, just waiting to break through. But what made her stomach churn even more was the realization that this wasn't just about the kitchen anymore. It was about something deeper, something far more insidious. Ben had never been just a part of the team. He had always been a player, a pawn in a much larger game. "Who are you working for, Ben?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who's behind this?" Ben's smile widened. "You really think you're in control? That you get to dictate the terms of this game? There's always someone above you, Amara. Someone with more power, more influence. Her chest tightened as she struggled to process his words. She had to hold it together. She couldn't let him see her crumble. "Tell me," she said, her voice shaking. "Who are they? What do they want?" But Ben was already turning away, his hand slipping into his pocket. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, he was gone, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. Amara stood frozen, her mind reeling, her heart racing. She felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, the world around her slipping into chaos. The man she had trusted, who she had believed was on her side, was now a stranger, an enemy. And the worst part was, he wasn't the only one. As the seconds stretched on, her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to the present. She fumbled to pull out, her hands clammy. It was a message from Evelyn. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought." Amara's blood ran cold. The walls that had seemed so solid just hours before were crumbling around her. She wasn't just facing one betrayal now. She was staring down the barrel of something much more dangerous. She had underestimated how deep this ran, how far the deception stretched. The kitchen, the team, Ben, they were all pieces in a much larger puzzle. Her mind raced, her instincts kicking in. She couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. As she turned on her heel and walked back toward the restaurant, her heart pounded with a new urgency. She had to stop this before it destroyed everything she had worked for. But as the darkness of the night closed in around her, one thought gnawed at her with an intensity that felt almost unbearable. How many others were involved? The restaurant was silent, the kind of stillness that enveloped you, pressing against your skin like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Amara stood at the kitchen's entrance, her fingers clutching the handle of the door, heart pounding in her chest. The air around her felt thick, almost suffocating, like she was on the edge of something that could break her, like a brittle thread stretched too tight. Inside, the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, but it seemed too loud in the moment. Every creak of the wood beneath her feet, every breath she took, reverberated in the emptiness, making the space feel colder, darker. She hadn't expected to come back here tonight. She hadn't planned on any of this. But here she was. The truth had come like a storm, violent, sudden, and now everything that had felt certain, everything she had worked for, was slipping through her fingers like sand. Amara's eyes moved across the kitchen. The once warm, familiar space now felt foreign. The counters, the knives, the shelves, all these things that had been a part of her dream, a part of her life for so long, now seemed like relics of a past that no longer existed. And there, standing at the far end of the kitchen, was Ben, the man who had once been her partner, her confidant, the man she had trusted with her vision, her soul. He stood there with his back to her, his arms crossed, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips. He didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he looked too calm, too sure of himself. "You knew I would come," she said, her voice harsh, breaking the silence. The words felt sharp on her tongue. Ben didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, as if savoring the moment. Then, slowly, he rotated on his heels, facing her with that same casual, almost bored expression. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," he said, his voice smooth, deceptively calm. "You always were a bit too trusting, Amara. Too idealistic." She couldn't keep the tremor from her hands as she stepped further into the kitchen. Her eyes were locked on him, but her mind was racing. Every step she took felt like walking on fragile ground, as if she were tiptoeing around an explosion. "You sold us out. You sold me out." Ben raised an eyebrow, uncrossing his arms as he took a step toward her. "It's not that simple," he said. "You've been so consumed with your little dream, your restaurant, that you didn't see the bigger picture. You didn't see what I was building, what we could have built together. Together." Amara's chest tightened. "You never cared about what I built. You never cared about this place. It was never about us. It was always about you." He smirked, stepping closer now, his movements deliberate. "You think I'm the only one who's guilty here?" His voice lowered, turning more dangerous. You think you're any different? What do you think you've been doing all this time, Amara? You think I didn't notice the way you always took the credit? The way you put yourself above everyone else? His words struck her like a slap in the face, leaving her breathless, stunned. She staggered back a step, the force of his accusation rattling her. But there was something cold in his eyes that snapped her out of her daze, something calculating, something she had missed all along. I built this kitchen. I built this place, she said, her voice tight with a mixture of hurt and anger. I trusted you. You were my right hand, my partner. And now I find out you've been working against me the entire time. Don't flatter yourself, Ben shot back, stepping even closer, his voice growing colder. You were never really in control, Amara. You've been a pawn in someone else's game, a puppet dancing on strings. A silence followed, a silence that was heavy with the weight of his words, like 100 unspoken truths hung in the air between them. Amara could feel her pulse in her throat, every beat like a drum echoing in her chest. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the truth was too sharp, too painful. She had always been so sure of herself, so sure of her vision. And now, everything she had believed in, everything she had fought for, seemed like a lie. Ben had been playing a different game all along, and she had been too blinded by her own idealism to see it. You think you've won? She asked, her voice trembling now, the rawness of the moment sinking in. You think this is the way to do it? You think you can just take everything from me and walk away? Ben smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. You think I'm walking away? His laugh was low, almost dark. No, Amara, this isn't about walking away. This is about taking what's mine. Amara's breath hitched. What's yours? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper, barely able to contain the shock that had settled in her chest. This place, this dream, this kitchen. Ben didn't answer her directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the counter toward her. The sudden motion caught Amara off guard, and she stared at it for a long moment before finally reaching out to grab it. Her fingers brushed against the paper, sending an electric shock up her spine as she opened it. The letter inside was brief, but its contents made her vision blur with disbelief. It was a contract, a buyout agreement, signed by her, her signature, her name, but in a different context. The deal was already set in motion. Ben had arranged for someone else to take over her restaurant, to buy her out from under her without her knowledge. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. You didn't. Ben's eyes never left hers. I did, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. For the first time, Amara felt her knees weaken. She gripped the counter to steady herself, but it didn't help. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was giving way, like everything she had worked for was slipping out of her control, out of her reach. You bastard, she spat, her voice hoarse with anger. She stood up straight, forcing herself to meet his gaze. You think this is how it ends? With you getting everything and me losing everything? Ben smirked again, taking another step toward her. I've always been better at playing the game, Amara. You never stood a chance. The weight of his words, the coldness in his tone, it all hit her like a wave. She had been so sure of herself, so determined to protect her dream. But now, standing here, with the truth crashing down around her, she realized just how small she had been in the grand scheme of things. She was just a player in someone else's game, and Ben had made damn sure she never had a chance to win. The tension between them thickened, the silence stretching until it felt unbearable. Amara felt her breath come faster, her pulse racing as her mind spun with all the possibilities, all the pain she was now facing. Ben had taken everything, but she wasn't going to let him take her spirit too. I'm not done, she said, her voice low, dangerous. She didn't know how she would fix this, but she wasn't going to let him have the last word. Not yet. The streets outside were quiet now, the soft hum of the city in the distance barely breaking the stillness that had settled over Amara. She stood alone in the alley behind the restaurant, her hands pressed against the cold brick wall as she took in shallow breaths, trying to steady herself after the storm of emotions that had just torn through her. The neon sign of her restaurant flickered faintly behind her, casting a ghostly glow on the damp pavement. It seemed unreal, all of it, like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Her heart was heavy, the weight of everything she had just discovered pressing down on her chest. Ben's betrayal had shattered her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had known the risks, the difficulties of trying to carve a path in the world of chefs, but she had never imagined that the one person she had trusted the most could be the one to destroy everything she had built. The restaurant, the dream, her sense of self. But now, standing here in the cold, with the neon flickering weakly behind her, Amara realized that there was more at stake than just her business. More at stake than the contract, the buyout agreement, the betrayal. It was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of who she was. She had spent so many years defining herself by this restaurant, by the success and the recognition. It had been her identity. The work had consumed her, and in the process, she had closed herself off from everything else. The people who cared for her, the friends who had tried to remind her that there was more to life than a kitchen. And now, with everything slipping away, she was left with nothing but the raw truth of her own actions, her own choices. The door behind her creaked open, the sound cutting through the night. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She had been expecting this moment. She had known this conversation was coming. "I know you're angry," came the voice of Rosa, the restaurant's longtime head waitress, her voice soft but firm. "And you have every right to be, but you don't have to carry all of this alone." Amara closed her eyes for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rosa didn't answer immediately, and Amara could hear the faint rustle of her apron as she stepped closer, until she was standing beside her, looking out at the darkened street. "Ben told me," she said quietly, her tone full of sorrow. "He came to me earlier today, said he was going to take over, that you were too caught up in your own head to see the truth." Amara's stomach twisted at the mention of Ben's name. The betrayal burned all over again, but she didn't let the anger take over. "Not now. I thought I could trust him," she said, her voice ragged. "I thought he wanted this with me. We built this together. Or at least, I thought we did." Rosa nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know, Amara. You worked hard for this. But sometimes, people are only in it for themselves. And sometimes, they'll betray you in the worst possible way. But that doesn't mean it's the end. Isn't it?" Amara's voice cracked, the weight of everything finally coming to a head. "What am I supposed to do now, Rosa? The restaurant's gone. I've lost everything." "You haven't lost everything," Rosa said, her voice steady. "You still have yourself. And you still have the people who care about you. The ones who see you for more than just the chef who runs this place." Amara's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not while she still had some control over the situation. "I've been so focused on this dream," she said, her voice trembling. "I let it consume me. And now, it's all falling apart. I don't even know who I am without it." Rosa's hand rested gently on her shoulder, a quiet comfort in the midst of the storm. "You're not just this restaurant, Amara. You're not just the chef. You're more than that. You're a person, a human being who's done things for herself. You're not defined by what you do, but by who you are. And you've done a lot, more than most people could ever dream of." The words didn't fix everything, but for the first time since Ben's betrayal, Amara felt a flicker of hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The weight of her choices didn't disappear, and the anger still churned inside her, but the reminder of who she was beyond the kitchen began to ease the suffocating feeling in her chest. "I don't know if I can let go of this place," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I need to. Maybe it's time to walk away." Rosa didn't speak for a long moment, letting the words hang between them. The silence was heavy, but not oppressive. It was space where Amara could breathe again, where she could think. "You don't have to walk away forever," Rosa said at last. "But you do need to take a step back. For yourself. This place doesn't have to define you, Amara. You're bigger than this. You're more than a chef. You've got a heart that's capable of so much more. Don't let Ben's betrayal make you forget that." The weight of those words settled deep in her soul, shifting something inside her. It wasn't an easy fix. There were no neat answers, no simple solutions. But in that moment, Amara realized that her journey wasn't about the restaurant. It wasn't about the betrayal, or the betrayal of trust that had left her reeling. It was about how she moved forward from here. "You're right," Amara whispered, the tears finally starting to fall. But this time, there was a sense of release in them. "It's not just about the restaurant. It's about me." Rosa smiled softly, her presence a calming force beside her. "That's all I'm saying." As Amara stood there, gazing at the fading glow of the restaurant sign, the reflections of streetlights dancing across the wet pavement, she felt the weight of everything she had lost. And yet, in that loss, there was the faintest sense of freedom, a possibility, a chance to rebuild, not just her career, but herself. She didn't know what the future would bring, or what the next step in her journey would be. But she knew this. She wasn't done yet. She still had the strength to forge a new path, to rise from the ashes of what had been lost. And for the first time in a long while, Amara took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool night air, and allowed herself to let go of the past.